I'd like to invite my first panel, Professor Sudhir Chawla. If you can sit in that order, I'll be great. So, Sudhir, this. Oh. Very quickly. Sudhir is a professor, chaired professor in the financial course at the Sherlock College of Business. Is also the director of the Quantitative and Computational Finance program, which is nationally top 10 ranked, and also is the director of the FinTech Lab. Up next is Roop Singh. He's the founder of the Fluid Factory. He's a blockchain expert. He's going to give a TED talk next quarter on blockchain. Go check that out. TEDx Atlanta. And he's also an author on blockchain. And then finally, we've got Vishal Venkatam from GE Power. He's the CIO there, and he spent most of his career at GE Power, so has some deep expertise in that sector, and he's going to tell us more about his foray into blockchain. So let me get started. All right, so let me start with Roop. So Roop, I want to say when it comes to blockchain, we've seen a lot of frenzy in the startup world. A lot of startups with ICOs last year. Relatively speaking, we haven't seen as much activity from large enterprises, partly because of the hesitation. You don't want to dump a lot of resources and into a risky project, so that makes sense. But in your opinion, where do you see the biggest opportunity for large enterprises?
So we're definitely coming down from the peak of inflated expectations that we saw in the Gartner hype cycle. We're coming to a place where there's a lot more maturity about the topic. It's not all fluff anymore. For larger enterprises, there are a few lenses you can look at. One, I think they have, it's easy for them to figure out the how once they've gone past the forces of internal resistance, as I call them, for anything new and innovative and change-worthy. Once they've gone past that, you can look at the fact that they can figure out the how, but they're still struggling to find the why. Why is this relevant in their environment, in their ecosystem? What will it change in terms of their supply chain partners, in terms of how consumers would react to it, and how underlying technology could solve technical problems behind the scenes. So that's one area, and I think Vishal will speak a little bit more about how do you find out useful use cases and applications in the specific environment that they're in. So I'll try to look at these from three standpoints. The question is blockchain opportunity, a threat, or a risk? So let's start with the last one. What's the risk? One of the areas of application is GDPR. GDPR is here. GDPR 2 is about to come. Countries like China and Japan and the United States are looking to add more regulation in that direction. So companies have to be GDPR compliant. And blockchain can be a very easy way for them to develop data management solutions that are blockchain compliant. And if they don't do so, there's a risk associated with that. Now let's talk about threat. There are certain areas where blockchain now, or startup companies using blockchain technology can be viewed as a threat, or even internally within the large enterprise ecosystem, where companies developing applications and platforms that actually could be a threat within that ecosystem. And maybe later I'll give you a few examples. In the opportunity size, so the lens to look at there is why should we apply blockchain? Right? There's three factors I look at. One, blockchain is a mechanism of trust efficiency. If you're not solving an inherent trust problem, then don't use blockchain. It's like that Dilbert cartoon. Second, it's a mechanism of business process efficiency and improvement. And that too, if you're not getting transformational or massive business process improvement, for instance, if you're not reducing the time for payment processing from 4 days, 5 days to a few seconds, then there's no use to look into a new technology when you can do what you can do today with current state of technology. Right? And the third, obviously, is security. Looking at, if you guys have been following the news, the Marriott hack just a couple of days ago, it's going to turn out to be, 500 million records, possibly the biggest hack in the history of hacks. Then even the more recent one than that, if you looked at Quora, about 100 million user profiles compromised. So security is a problem that enterprises or any one of us as consumers also face, and it's not going to go away. So if you can find these three legs of the solution, trust efficiency, business process improvement, and security, then you have a useful application. And that could lead to strategic applications in the enterprise space where you can develop new business models and you can develop new markets properly. Or it could lead to tactical applications where you're just improving the business process slightly and maybe you're reducing technical debt and it's very internal focused.
Do you think enterprises should focus on developing the technology in-house or just outsource it and acquire when it's ripe in the form of a startup?
Well, I think the predominant model enterprises have followed is acquisition because of a number of things, the culture of innovation, etc. Now, having said that, I think it's going to be, what we'll find is you've got to combine not just experience and expertise with the technology, but understanding of the specific domains that they're in. Without understanding the status quo, but not getting tied in the status quo. So having a deep grasp of it, but having an outside-in view on how things could change. So I think enterprises have a certain leg up, if you will, because they understand their landscape better than anybody outside would. But they need to then partner with companies who have a more innovative mindset and can look at it from the outside in. So the answer to me is that today there is a huge chasm between the enterprises and the startup ecosystem in the blockchain space, if you will. I think we need to come together, and there are consortiums that are doing it.
Vishal, as somebody who represents one of the large enterprises, you are well aware that blockchain is sliding down that Gartner hype cycle as we saw and heading toward the so-called trough of disillusionment. I personally think that's a good thing because that's when the real work starts, when the paparazzi have left. So if you can share with us maybe some experiments or explorations at GE Power around blockchain.
Sure. So we started evaluating blockchain at the start of the cycle itself, when it was in its infancy. And obviously the first few things that we were looking at were around the areas of financial settlement. And mostly to do with cross-border settlement and not within a country settlement. Ran a few pilots and found some interesting results. I can't share certain things.
Sure.
Okay. Found some interesting results. And to understand the complexity of large enterprises, and when I speak, I was on the panel with Group, I don't know, a few months ago, I guess. And I had UPS along with me. And when I started explaining this, I think everyone in the panel started like, yes, we also have this problem. The problem doesn't come with just the technology. It's how technology and regulatory alliances go hand in hand. For me to settle in certain countries, I have to have a local legal entity hold it, manage it, have its own trial balance, have clear demarcation of receivables versus payables, the flow, and all of those types of things. Blockchain eliminates a lot of those things, but I'm forced by regulatory forces within those countries to have that level of granularity, visibility, and if you have a local partner there, clear dividend payment splits that go into, or profit sharing, even at a higher level, clearly demarcated in your accounting statements. And the challenge is which comes first. In case of something like this, you literally settle immediately. Whereas if you were to go the true trial balance route and settle, you need to go through the whole equation before you arrive at the answer. But here you're arriving at the answer and then trying to form the question. Okay, regulators don't understand how to deal with the situation. That's the first thing. So that's on the finance side, and that's where I think 90% of the use cases of blockchain have been. It originated with ICOs and cryptocurrencies and extrapolated itself in the banking space where people took it and said, oh, they're doing this and two untrusted parties can settle without any issues. How do I take it to the next level and allow enterprises to do it? Enterprises at that point in time, I'm literally settling if we do legal entities, very trusted. But what I loved was the speed of transaction. I was bypassing the regulatory layer completely. That's why my auditor slapped my hand. Okay, okay, it may work for Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, but it won't work for US dollars to euro. At that point in time, I need to file taxes in both. I need to get a VAT refund in one place for a transaction. I need to do a triangulation with two countries before I can file, for my tax treatment, those kinds of things. And that's where we ran into some challenges. That's one area. Supply chain is another area, but supply chain is not an area that, for me, my suppliers are trustworthy. That's the first premise. So GE Power is in the business of making large gas turbines, steam turbines, generators, and the balance of plant for generating electricity. By nature of our business, I have to qualify my suppliers. I have to make sure that they're capable of producing the complex designs that we come up with. So there is no loss of trust. I literally go in, I pay for them to qualify. And in that particular case, when I place a demand onto my ecosystem, it is a group of 4 suppliers who are responding back. It isn't that I just throw it out into the cloud and have a random person sitting in Vietnam dreaming of how he would efficiently solve that problem. We haven't reached that stage yet. Okay, but in a few years' time, we want to get there. The challenge right now is, if you take a step back, we are in the middle of being disrupted, and we are disrupted. Stock price is where it is at this juncture, and renewables and solar are eating our new market share. We have a phenomenal backlog, but solar, these guys are eating our market share. But now, what do we do at that point in time? I have to go one step further into the market. I can't just stay with my current customer pool. I'm trying to go one step further, 2 steps further. I'm trying to disrupt what others are not looking at. That's where transparency of information flow across either untrusted parties or parties that are not customer to me begin to happen. We haven't seen that level of evolution in the ecosystem yet. The technology exists to an extent to solve for that. But now, in essence, how do I tell my customer, I would like to bypass you and go to your customer, get that information, but make your life better? That hasn't happened yet. It's like buying real estate directly from, or real estate or a house from a housing company or a construction company, and telling a broker, don't worry about it, I have no agreement with you, but I'll still pay you for that transaction. We haven't come to that level of maturity in that particular space. But if you look at it from a 5-year evolution perspective or a 10-year evolution perspective, it has to happen. Markets are being disrupted where native producers of energy are moving away from being net consumers to net producers.
Does that refer to the distributed power, shift toward distributed power?
Distributed power is one, that's the next step after that. I'm just talking about my own customer. I have, look at the oil price today. The oil price is, I think, $60 a barrel or a little less than that right now. And you have ExxonMobil, who has a huge fleet of energy producing assets, saying, do I produce oil at $60 or do I drill oil at $60 or do I wait for it to go up to the book? Because there's really glut of supply. And if you look at the prediction of the oil market, it's going to go up to 52 $52 a barrel on the Brent. The Texas one is even cheaper. Then you start looking at it and saying, now what happens? Does ExxonMobil continue to be a net consumer of energy, or does it use its idle assets to start producing electricity? Total in France has now moved away from just being a consumer to a producer of electricity. This is the shift in the marketplace. I have vendors and practitioners, disruptors, they call themselves all of these things these days, contact me virtually on a daily basis saying, let's talk. But nobody puts any of these paradigm shifts as part of their context spiel. It just seems to be buy blockchain from me. And what I want, and this is to everyone in the audience, make it personal. message it in such a way that I can monetize your message. That part is completely missing.
Clearly fintech is one area where we've seen large enterprises, banks essentially jump all in, and I think they're one of the pioneers in developing solutions on blockchain. What are some of the interesting areas of application in fintech?
First, I've been teaching a fintech class for the last 4 years, looking at blockchain in the context of financial service innovation. But blockchain is much bigger than just fintech. So I commend Nishant, I think, for taking the initiative here, and I think starting this because there's interest across many colleges, across many disciplines in the industry. So I think that's a great thing to have done. So as far as the blockchain is concerned, being an academic, always I think I'm slightly skeptical about things. I think in terms of so let me say, take a step back, and I think as my fellow panelists have said, I think first we have to make sure that it's not a solution in such of a problem. In a way, I think that's part of the thing, I think, which is, it's a great solution, but for what problem is it the solution for? So what is it that I think the existing businesses or existing things can't do? I think that the blockchain can do better, and why is it needed? I think it has to start there. Again, going back to the payments, for example, again, Ripple, I think, is a classic case in a way cross-border payments take multiple days. So people are talking about Ripple, I think, is doing it in almost instantaneously. But the flip side is that in the existing technologies, they don't actually sit quietly, right? I think the disruption and disrupted. So there's a back and forth. So right now we have real-time payments in the US where instant payments can be again, it's a consortium which is trying to do that. And the same thing with Swift, I think. Swift, again, before it used to take 3-4 days. But now Swift GPI, I think they are trying to do the same thing. So then I think the use case was when this takes 4 days for cross-border payment, it's much easier to make a case for blockchain. But existing technologies, they start and say, okay, we can do it in the same day using existing things. Then the question is, okay, why do you need a blockchain in this? I think does it fit? So the big issue where I see is, I think the blockchain, before I go to the fintech thing, is it's being dropped in the middle of the process chain, I think, without actually rethinking the entire process. Where does it actually add value? Why does it add value? It's almost like a business process reengineering. So one has to rethink and say, how does it add value? If you put garbage in blockchain, it becomes a very secure, immutable garbage. But I think at the end of the day, what does it solve? I think that's part of the issue. I think why in the Gartner hype cycle, because solutions, the technology was ahead. So I think that's why there's a lot of hype. But then when it meets the reality, it came down a bit. So whereas, I think again, but at the same time, again, I'm optimistic. I think that's why I've been teaching about it and I think working on it, is where the permission blockchains in the finance space, I think, make a good use case. Again, they're not there yet. I think, for example, the blockchains, I think many times the utopia for them is to completely, again, trust comes through algorithm. Again, that's the broad idea, right? But I think many times, I think as Vijay was saying, you have a limited set of partners. It's much easier, much computationally and energy-wise, much more efficient just to restrict to a few set of parties and then basically share information across them. This becomes a cost-efficient thing. For example, DTCC, I think, has done some pilots with Accenture, R3, and digital assets, where they say that some of them they can scale up to 150 million transactions across the banks. But again, the use case there is you have a limited number of partners where it becomes a good case to reduce costs for post-trade settlement. Why should trade settlement take 3 days? Can we do it like T0 is trying to do? Can we do on the same thing? But the key thing there's a limited number of partners, I think, which are pre-qualified. It's not exactly the Bitcoin blockchain or the permissionless blockchain, but a permission blockchain where you're actually adding value because it's becoming the post-trade processing kind of thing. You're becoming more cost efficient. You can actually sell it at a cost. Even then, I think there's a lot more to be done. But at least I think in the short run, I think that's where I see permission blockchain, where I see value. And the other side I see, I think one of the reasons why maybe the hype cycle has come down is, if you look at all the ICOs that came in, around $18 billion raised world over, again, the utility tokens, many of them are in a way straight away scams. So if one thinks about it, I think it's this 90, I think in terms of one, plots the actual, I'm actually doing research on that. So if one plots the actual usage of the application per se and the utility token, you see the application usage is much lower. That basically means almost 95, 99% of the tokens, they're for speculation, where there's no actual underlying business case why you need a utility token, even forgetting the regulatory kind of thing. So I think that's, the issue. And the final thing to think about is, again, in terms of going back to, contracts, in terms of utility and other things in electricity. People think about where blockchain, you can have smart contracts on top of them, but where again the hype versus the reality one should be careful about is, the real world is not all complete contracts, where you can specify each state of the world, and then basically if the state of the world happens, again you can actually settle automatically. It might be an oracle through consensus, it might happen. But the real world, I think many of the interactions that happen are incomplete contracts, where we can't actually know all the states of the world and what would happen, and this negotiation that happens. Just by putting through a blockchain and writing a smart contract on them, it actually gets applied to the real world. That's where again the hype versus reality. So the way I see it is, again, to summarize, I think there's some use cases, and I think maybe this is often attributed to Bill Gates, I think, but we always overestimate what happens in 2 years, but underestimate what happens in 10 years. I think that's how I see it. It's going to be, technology is going to run ahead, is going to search for a business problem where it can apply to, and I think right now, I think it might be a bit more start with permission blockchain, but unless huge technological improvements and zero knowledge proofs and the computational efficiency of that, some of them are made, I don't see like it happening, I think, to the truly permissionless blockchain where anyone can transact with other. That's how I see it.
Yeah, I want to say, I think in terms of smart contracts, we'll see small sort of incremental changes. Things like derivatives market, that's an easy setting where it's a simple contract, it's yes or no, and based on that you get a payment. I think that we'll start with smaller contracts like that and perhaps go to bigger.
Yeah, sure. I think the small ones, I think it's where you have very clearly set of criteria, and this happens, this happens. That's why DTCC, I said, that's where it's trying to do the credit defaults of contracts, some other contracts. But even there, I think the standard exchange kind of contracts, you can do that. But once it goes back to a credit defaults of kind of contract, again, there might be, even though it's ISD approved, there might be some cases where it's not really clear. The default, I think, and what type of default, there might be litigation that comes afterwards. So all this would be resolved. It's not an insurmountable problems, but all it is, they're not as easy as to write a contract as some of the startups try to make it. But this is the skeptic in me. So, yeah.
Ruth, any thoughts on permission versus private, public blockchains?
Yeah, sure. So let's expand the lens a little bit. If I could draw it 2 by 2, it's permission and permissionless and permission-based, then public and private. So you get 4 combinations thereof, and each of these have their own particular use cases that could be applied. Now, just an overall discussion point, the idea that enterprises must go to a permission-based blockchain, that's been debated hotly. There are arguments to be made to be on an open public infrastructure, depending on how secure and stable that infrastructure is. The bigger problem to solve for enterprises is confidentiality. Who gets to see the data? Who gets to own the data? And if you go to a distributed architecture, who really owns the infrastructure itself? So if you start looking from those lens, you'll get all these combinations. So the point that Dr. Sudhir was making, today enterprises are looking at permission-based or even permission-based private chains. And that may be a route to go for them for the next 10, 15 years or so. But there is a thought process that says, well, eventually we will have multiple of these blockchains, essentially for each particular domain or each use case. So for instance, you could have one predominant de facto chain for settlements. You could have one for identity management. You could have one for gaming. You could have one for supply chain in a particular asset. You could have one for marine insurance, for instance. The other side of the equation is we need to figure out how we're going to come together as an ecosystem. So the challenge is not still with the technology. Any one of these possible technology combinations that are available today. It's how we can make agreements in terms of what we can share and what's the business model. So that's one layer of discussion.
Vishal, your thoughts on this discussion about public versus private permission blockchain?
So when we started looking at it, we didn't even look at the public blockchain infrastructure or public blockchain mechanisms. We went private, and it has to do with two things. A lot of examples, and me being on the enterprise side, data protection and data security of my customers' information, be it anything, whether it's my asset that I'm maintaining for him or his utilization that I am researching and analyzing to help him make more money. All that is very personal to that organization. So startups, for example, went to some of our customers and said, what if we showed all your assets to everyone? Okay. Think of what possibilities this is. And then we went to them and said, sure, you can show that asset, but by the way, if that asset information is shown to someone else, then I will raise my hand and walk away, and here's $150 million invoice that I'm going to cut to you. Okay. So therein lies your smart contract. It's not a very yes and no type equation. It is that. That's one. We have an IoT platform called Predix, which hosts data from BP, Exxon, all of it. In theory, if we were in a utopian world, I could literally put these on a public domain, whether it's blockchain or whatever, and then extrapolate it for people to make quick decisions and quick information. First thing BP says is, I don't want anyone to see my data. And which I clearly understand. If you know BP's production mechanisms and criteria and how they are managing their rigs, I'm very sure ExxonMobil could, get a 2% benefit to their bottom line just by understanding what someone else is doing with their rigs, and vice versa. Hence, that trade protectionism and the inherent fear of my competition looking at my data comes into play. So when you take all those factors into account, your private blockchain with permission seems to be the first step for any large enterprise to go into. And we did that level of analysis. It took us about 3 hours to say, okay, this is the way we need to go because of all the challenges that we have. And last but not least, my internal security teams and compliance teams and my lawyers are shit scared about, doing anything else. The level of education and the level of maturity that exists within the ecosystem in order for us to make a decision is very low. If I were to bring my legal counsel into the panel, you would have one guy who would basically not even speak in this panel. and that's no one in the blockchain, I don't call them consortium, think tank, the guys who have thought about this, ever took that into account. How do you educate the process chain or the value chain? So you spoke about that. Like where in your process chain, where in your value chain does the technology go into? But on top of that process chain and value chain are actors, are personas, whose livelihood depends on the work that they do. You're disrupting their livelihood, but at the same time you're telling them, I'm also going to disrupt what you stand for. And human tendency will not allow for you to do that. And we refuse to acknowledge that, and we refuse to push the technology in a way without taking into account the other pieces of the ecosystem.
So if I can just comment on that, I think strategically, if you look on a longer term evolution, the movement is towards platforms. You can talk about one company putting their business processes using even a permission chain, but the real value can only come from a set of parties. So it's set of, even in the insurance world, healthcare, take your pick. So the idea that we can all share some resources and we can define the rules of what to share and when to share and who owns these resources. Once we can get there, then we have a more strategic level of enablement, if you will. But before that, we are left with the disconnected business processes and disconnected ecosystem, or the way it's connected today. I mean, some, as you mentioned, there are some problems that don't need to be solved. I already have a trust. There is no trust issue here. So why worry about it? But why spend all this time, effort, energy?
So let's take a corollary to this. It is a shared ecosystem or shared platform, whichever way you look at it. Its ability to manage permission-based or permissionless, depending on the level of authentication that you put into the system or permissions that you give. Okay, it's fairly straightforward. A lot of people have been doing this for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
The question, it's not a question, and we have a use case that I can't talk about here, that we're actively exploring. And one of that, I'm having significant trouble with my sales team to show them we have come up with a monetization idea. And it is not about incremental operating margin or incremental contribution margin today, but the avoidance of losing market share or losing margin over the next 5 years. And I'm having trouble, exceeding amount of trouble, trying to tell them if you don't do this, in 5 years' time, you could be a Dunkin' Donuts. And only two things drive people to do something: fear and greed. That's my philosophy. And I don't know what else I need to do. And I don't have an ecosystem partner, and I have all the big names, these of the world. We've all tried, but even they don't understand some of these things. And that's what we're all struggling with, is how do I take something and now, tell my team, this is what you need to maybe look at. And that's the education cycle through the hype and through the tough that we need help with.
As we wrap up the session, Sudhir, I want to touch on regulation, something that Vishal mentioned, and of course matters a lot in the financial sector. Any thoughts on regulation lagging behind, or what do you think where the regulation is headed in the fintech sector?
I think, just to take again a step back, there's three things I think as people are talking about which are important. Economics of it, which includes the business case, I think that's very important, including the people. And the second is the technology, in a way, the technological innovations that need to be done in the blockchain, I think, distributed ledgers itself. And third is the regulation, I think. So in the fintech space, I think, again, the US, I think, now that OCC like a couple of weeks back, and then everyone is aware of, I think, these things they're actually talking about, and can we set up a regulatory sandbox in the US, similar to what's being done in England, I think, in order to take these issues. And some other countries are a bit ahead, but I think it again goes back to first finding a good use case, I think, and then basically DTCC goes to regulators and say we already have 40 players who are part of us, that we're doing this. That's one way of going. I think the second is a startup comes with an idea in this space, and then we are doing it and then trying to get regulatory approval. I think is the tougher one. If it comes from big players, and I think where they co-opt the regulation, I think might be easier.
Last question, Roop, any predictions on timeline in terms of when we'll see production-ready enterprise solutions on blockchain?
Well, I think people will make predictions, so we need to tread carefully on that. I'll just connect the dots here.
It's not recorded, so you can.
I think what's going to happen is, at one scale, you see, we talked about ICO. So let's look at the startup ecosystem for a quick second. There's a lot of innovation happening. There is a lot of excitement. There's a lot of passion. Yeah, you may say, from one point of view, you may say that it's misguided or not fully informed, and that may be fair. But on the other hand, you need to look at the innovation that is actually happening, the amount of people globally that are into the space, and not solving just trivial problems, but actually changing the world in some ways. So we're about to publish some research on what makes a good blockchain business. What are the different dimensions that you need to understand and improve upon in order to actually have a thriving business and not just mere technology. Technology sitting in a lab is not worth anything. Adoptive technology is worth something. So I think what's going to happen is slowly we will find, going back to what Vishal was saying, there is a Go back 10 years ago, 15 years ago. These are the statements people made, actually 20 years ago rather, about the internet. You know, then ask what happened to Blockbuster, ask what happened to the publishing industry, ask what happened to the financial market. The companies that we invest in today, the Googles, the Facebooks of the internet world, the Amazon, the Instagrams, Twitter, weren't around a few years ago. And for some of them, we're still struggling to find business models. To his point, innovative technology enables new business models. It's up to us to find them now. And that's the race we are in, so to say.
I think that's all of the time we have. Thank you so much. So